This is the introduction to the book Theodor Adorno and the Century of the Negative. Now, what is this and why am I reading it? This contextualizes and gives background history to what Adorno's project is and where he's coming from. And I think it serves well enough as a standalone, self-contained essay that shows how Adorno's concept of historical development and the concept of identity and his overall philosophical project and how he develops it. To give a brief summary of what's going on here and why I think it's important, the underlying concept that makes all of Adorno's other concepts like negative dialectics, culture industry, and instrumental reason important is his concern with identity and non-identity in the contemporary political sense, and the philosophical and social processes by which human beings understand themselves in the world. Adorno's project is to show that identity is never complete or self-transparent, and that genuine critical thought begins by attending to what escapes identity rather than what confirms it. As one formulation of this is put, identity, if it was to become an expansive concept, must also be a negative one. Rather than treating identity as something immediately given or positively possessed, we must begin from its fracture. Indeed, people first experience identity negatively, and no identity is born pure. Identities are always the result of a negation, a recoil from an unreconciled, unemancipated state. Identity is therefore something to be understood not simply as an expression of who we are, but a historical response to alienation, domination, and contradiction. This perspective also explains Adorno's distinctive philosophical method. Quote, to think about non-identity is to think against the subject's myth of self-creation and to consider the subject in a force field of negations, borrowings, and displacements. So the task of philosophy is not to produce systems that perfectly reconcile subject and object, theory and practice, but to remain faithful to what resists conceptual capture. This is why Adorno remains suspicious of any philosophy that promised complete reconciliation. Quote, the attempt to turn the celebrated unity of theory and praxis into a simple identity threatened to turn dialectics into its opposite, authoritarian dogma, reactionary behavior, and subjective self-contentment. Dialectics for Adorno survives only by refusing premature closure and resisting the temptation to collapse contradiction into certainty. Far from being an abstract concern, this analysis reaches into politics and social life today. The concept of identity has become so prevalent in the contemporary discourse that it is difficult to measure its bound. More than that, the concept of identity has become so common, so deeply embedded in the discourse of politics, culture, and society that it has become at once a universal answer and a universal problem. Adorno's philosophy seeks to understand how identity can serve both emancipation and domination, and both liberation and exclusion. For that reason, the critique of identity is never merely philosophical. Quote, one could not understand nationalism or terrorism, liberation or domination, fascism or liberalism, without addressing identity and negative identity together. Adorno's project is therefore not to abolish identity, but to expose its contradictions, to understand the wounds from which it arises, and to preserve the possibility of a more genuinely emancipated form of human universality. Theodor Adorno and the Century of Negative Identity by Erich Oberle. Introduction: Identity, Theory, and Praxis. In 1966, when the German Jewish philosopher and sociologist Theodor Adorno published Negative Dialectics, the volume was chiefly understood as a provocation. The book's opening legs, proclaiming that philosophy lived on because the moment of its actualization was missed, invoked Marx's thesis on Feuerbach in a way that seemed intended to aggravate. Conservatives read it as a confession of an unrepentant communist. Radicals were perplexed by the inversion of the young Marx. If Marx's original thesis had said, hitherto, philosophy has merely interpreted the world, but the point is to change it, Adorno, the old Marxist, seemed to insist that the day of revolutionary action was over, that nothing could be done but retreat into the academic fastnesses of philosophical abstraction. During the next 3 years, the Frankfurt student body interposed itself between Adorno's words and his text, positing a different version of Marx's thesis by seeking to transform critical theory into a mode of action. As protests against the Vietnam War and the social role of universities grew pitched, attendance in Adorno's lectures became standing room only. His books came into high demand. his lectures on Kantian ethics, ontology, and the principles of sociology became meeting points for student radicals and targets for student protest. The irony is compounded as the Institute for Social Research, rebuilt after the war adjacent to Frankfurt's Goethe University with the help of American occupation funds, was occupied by protesters demanding a return to the Institute's Marxian origins. Adorno, protective of the Institute yet sympathetic towards the students, continued to take the double stance suggested in Negative Dialectics, sharpening his criticism of the contemporary situation while denouncing the actionistic leather jacket wing of the student movement that favored direct, even blind protest actions and police provocation over theoretical discussion. Words became flesh during the spring semester of 1969 when Adorno's lectures were regularly disrupted by protest. On April 22nd, two groups interrupted the introduction to the dialectic. The first group demanded that the lecture be converted to a teach-in, calling on Adorno to submit a self-critique on the universities and his own relation to authoritarian governance. They wrote on the chalkboard, "Whoever allows Adorno's words to govern will live their whole lives under capitalism." After Adorno assured this group that a lecture on the dialectic might prove relevant, he resumed speaking, only to be interrupted again. This time, three leather jacket-clad women stepped to the podium, baring their breasts, showered him with rose petals and kisses. This happening proved to be Adorno's last lecture. The rest of the semester was cancelled. Adorno died of a heart attack a few months later. Left behind for publication was Adorno's Marginalia on Theory and Practice, which, though replete with sympathetic gestures towards the student movement, was adamant about what he referred to as the non-identity of theory and practice. The thesis on Feuerbach, argued Adorno, did not teach the immediacy of action. Rather, they showed the desire for rebellion must never collapse meaningful political, philosophical distinctions. The attempt to turn the celebrated unity of theory and praxis into a simple identity threatened, he argued, to turn dialectics into its opposite: authoritarian dogma, reactionary behavior, subjective self-contentment. To underscore the concrete political dangers of such false identities, Marginalia pointed to press reports that compared the action and protest doctrines of the early extra-parliamentary opposition, which later formed the kernel of the Green Party, to the neo-Nazi German Nationalist Party. To equate these movements was itself a form of reaction. Yet students, the right-wing circles, and the liberal press were converging on actionism. Theories of action must not exploit or coerce identity, argued Adorno. They must heed differences among principles and context, among modes of activity, agency, and knowledge. In this sense, they were always in need of their work of theoretical reflection. This book is the first part of a two-volume study re-examining Adorno's life and the theory in terms of the history of a central but neglected contribution of critical theory, the critique of the identity concept that Adorno articulated in the middle decades of the 20th century but sought to refine up through the 1968-69 crisis. The concept of identity, embraced by the students in the late 1960s, was not Adorno's starting point. Yet, he was far more engaged with the challenge of identity than the students understood. The notion that personal identity, action in philosophy, could become identical in politics, that self-making could be action and theory in one, crystallized in a new form in the 1960s, but it emerged out of a broad and loose discourse articulated from a host of sources reaching back to the origin of the modern period. And it was first explicitly theorized by Frankfurt philosophers and social thinkers in general in exile in America in the 1940s. The idea that every action in society is either an act of cooperation or one of protest emerged from the logical notion of identity rooted in philosophy. The idea that the baring of breast could bring a halt to capitalist accumulation or the machinery of war had grown out of a vitalistic concept of personal identity and its ties to a notion of political culture. Together, these notions were contributing to a new way of thinking about politics and the ideals of emancipation it strives for. The idea that the personal is political and vice versa. Adorno was, during his American years, present at the creation of this new idea of personal identity. and he would develop it ex negativo in the course of the next 20 years into the concept of non-identity at the center of negative dialectics. If Adorno was, by the end of his life, in many respects, thinking along with the protesters, he came at the concept of identity with a longer history and a different perspective. Adorno and the student protesters of the New Left agreed that identity posed a challenge to the politics of social structures and rational interest. Where Adorno differed with the students was in his insistence that identity, if it was to become an expansive concept, must also be a negative one. Throughout Marginalia, Adorno invoked the idea of identity in a logical sense to show that the collapsing of categories differences is the first move in a brutalization of the intellect. He also, however, acknowledged that the importance of identity in the subjective sense, speaking of how violence accompanied the formation of group identities. Positing a parallel between thinking about alterity and respecting the rights of others, Adorno argued that deep within the tradition of modern selfhood, there exists a desire towards having a self, an identity. This desire liberates, but its other side, negative identity, rooted in loss and woundedness that emerged from the trauma of alienation and self-consciousness, is not only always present, but is prior. People first experience identity negatively, and identity has a history of actively willing the dissolution of the self into a collective identity, an unmediated relation in which thought is action, theory is practice, and violence is done to others to make them conform with the uncertain and weak self. If the 20th century's vision of achieving identity hoped to extend and radicalize the tradition of universal rights, Adorno sought to describe the shadow of this tradition, the weak link in its claim to self-grounding. Adorno's proposition was that through identities of self and deed must be taken seriously, they must also be criticized and reconceptualized in terms of their history of truth and falsity. No identity is born pure. Identities are always the result of a negation, a recoil from an unreconciled, unemancipated state. To think about non-identity is to think about the subject's myth of self-creation and to consider the subject in a force field of negations, borrowings, and displacements. Doing so, ironically, might strengthen the subject. One could not understand nationalism or terrorism, liberation or domination, fascism or liberalism, without addressing identity and negative identity together. Arguing dialectically, Adorno insisted that the negative side of identity, which looks like a side effect, is antecedent to every form of identity. Adorno came to think, however, that it was possible to work through identity as a form of retrograde self-consciousness, and thus liberate identity from the fear that drives it. This book offers a reconsideration of Adorno's argument for the logical priority and emancipatory potential of negative identity. Taking seriously the possibility that Adorno's negative approach to theorizing identity, though cut short by his early death, represented not only a challenge to the developing discourses of identity, but also an important clarification and extension to them. This book seeks to accomplish two goals. First, by engaging with the history of Adorno's intellectual development as a theorist of subjectivity, this book inquires into the historical and theoretical meaning of identity as a concept that has shaped the experience and interpretation of modern life since World War II. Second, it suggests that the language of negative identity, though only partly articulated at the same time of Adorno's death, offers a significant addition and refinement to the possibilities of theorizing identity. The history of positive identity is entwined with negative forms of identity. Identity as racism, prejudice, ontologized conflict, and victim blaming in a world of mass-mediated subjectivities. Arguing that the dual-sided nature of identity has been latent within the concept, this book suggests that if one comes to terms with this history, if one learns to address identity in both its positive and negative forms, it is possible not only to develop a better analytical language of social subjectivity, but also to imagine a new interdisciplinary social phenomenology based on a reinvigorated concept of objectivity. Identity and modern freedom. The concept of identity has become so prevalent in its contemporary discourse that it is difficult to measure its bounds. Historically, identity enjoyed its first success as an analytical term starting in the late 1950s, when Erik Erikson used it to describe the central psychological product of the process of maturation and self-development. Subjects become subjects as they achieve a stable identity and vice versa. This usage spread first gradually and then rapidly beyond the bounds of psychology and psychoanalysis, and identity became a political, philosophical, and cultural keyword that has reshaped the analysis of every social topic that touches on either the constitutive or performative dimensions of expression. A distillation of the modern logics of radical self-making, the language of subjective ideality, contains elements of this existentialist concept of authenticity. The psychoanalytical concept of egoity, the romantic ideal of expressive infinite self, and nationalist and collectivist notions of self-making through cultural self-determination. Though a complex historical and socio-theoretical inheritance, the concept of identity has become so common, so deeply embedded in the discourse of politics, culture, and society that it has become at once a universal answer and a universal problem. In the daily news, in the writings of historians, journalists, political theorists, philosophers, self-help therapists, and security experts, it appears with such frequency that its usage attests simultaneously to its clarity and precision and to its impossible vagueness and imprecision. Undoubtedly, identity's ever-expanding usage is linked to the changes in the concept of selfhood. Attesting to a broad-held sense that the self is the only true foundational concept in contemporary life, identity plays an important role in answering the question, who am I? And not just as a matter of introspection, but as a matter of professional or political self-understanding. When one speaks in the language of as an X I believe Y, one is drawing on the fact that identity's implied ontology reaches into fields of ethical life and epistemological deliberation. Positive identity means, in broad strokes, that the question, who am I, precedes and never fully leaves the discussion of questions of truth or obligation. Establishing a connection between a subjective and ontological who am I and questions of ethics, what should I do, and knowledge, how do I know what I know, identity presents itself at once as an organizing concept in an interdisciplinary discourse and as a post-disciplinary concept, a new master term that often preempts the need to negotiate the perspectives of different disciplines and different sources of authority. Embedded within this interlocking understanding is a logic of emancipation. In its ideal self-conception, to have an identity means to be awakened to who one is, and this awakening shapes subsequent questions of what one must do and how one sees and knows the world. This emphatic form of subjective identity, revealed in its relation to the existentialist concept of authenticity, itself a secularized religious concept of faith directed at the self, to become aware of one's identity is to become aware of the power of self-making, and this awareness divides the world into those who are authentic, who embrace their own identity, and those who seek or accept conformity. The ethicist Christian Korsgaard offers an example of how languages of identity have transformed the term of political thought. Korsgaard uses the language of identity to solve an old dilemma in ethics that pitted Aristotle's notion of public against Kant's notion of autonomy. For Korsgaard, to distinguish between theoretical and practical identity is to develop a post-metaphysical vocabulary of freedom, selfhood, and action that frames a much broader understanding of politics and personhood that was possible in either the Kantian or Aristotelian frameworks. Indeed, in many usages, where Kant would have spoken of practical and theoretical reason, and thus an absolute divide between knowledge of the self and knowledge of the world, Korsgaard speaks of a practical identity as a continuous unfolding chain of acts of a meaningfully self-constitution that includes such things as roles in relationships, citizenship, memberships in ethnic or religious groups, causes, vocations, professions, and offices. It may be important to you that you are a human being, a woman or a man, or a member of a certain profession, someone's lover or friend, a citizen or an officer of the court, a feminist or an environmentalist, or whatever. Even in this short passage, one can sense how closely Korsgaard, for example, with her use of the pronoun you, or the flippant existentialia of or whatever, wishes to cleave to the everyday language of self-determination and action. This is a hallmark of subjective identity, encapsulating the way the language of identity breaks down philosophy's more strict Kantian divide between knowing and doing, between practical and theoretical knowledge. In this regard, Korsgaard reflects the absorption of the multivalent existentialism into the everyday language of identity, typifying the way that the modern synthesis of practical and theoretical identity implicitly expands the classical categories of citizenship to include many once excluded dimensions of experience, including sexuality and gender, professional and interpersonal ethics, ethnic and religious affiliation. Offering a provocative synthesis of Kant and Aristotle, Korsgaard argues that the human beings constitute themselves through action that they understand to be self-making and world-making at once. Human beings deliberately decide what sorts of effects they wish to bring about in the world. In doing so, each individual is also deliberately deciding what sort of cause he or she will be. Through the identity concept's articulation in the field of psychology and its roots in existentialism lead it to emphasize the individual questions of being an identity have always been linked to questions of becoming an individual's identity have been complexly linked to collective identities. The simple way to put this is that identity is seen as something given but also as something earned, accompanied by a weaker sense of obligation to recognize and foster identity in others. Erikson, whose concept of identity subsumed for its notion of ego, along with the entire domain of culture, saw identity not just as the product of the Oedipal drama, the logic of identification with, the mother or father, but also an ongoing series of struggles with the conformity or rebellion with science or religion, with one's own industry or sense of inferiority. And this processual dimension of identity attests to the further fact that Erikson's way of speaking about identity incorporated a deep, half sociological, half anthropological sense of the psychological necessity of social affiliation. No one has an identity alone. The pursuit of identity is always already a kind of group or collective effort towards individuality. There is implied in Erikson's thought, and in the language of identity as it has developed in the last decade, a productive struggle between individuality and group affiliation. At the outer edge, identity is the sui generis, and it is a social law. On the one hand, individuals are imagined as needing to belong, to have group affiliations beyond themselves. On the other hand, individuals are imagined as creating unique identities out of these affiliations and the personal judgments as making necessary choices for determining their fidelity to themselves and throw that gaining perspective on how to acknowledge the necessary difference in others as well. The coexistence of necessity and freedom points to a widely felt tension among exclusionary and exilic, uncoerced, and free notions of identity and belonging. The origins of the mereological, individual, and group tension in this concept of identity go back to the mid-20th century, and they map onto the 20th century's disciplinary unclarity about relation between science, liberation, and progress. Mid-century discourses on identity, strongly informed by the anthropological assumptions, typically attempt to resolve the question of why the supposed universal need for identity had become so pressing in modernity by arguing that identity, though passively part of traditional societies, became an explicitly necessary goal of the individual only in modern societies. A little bit of Emile Durkheim's mechanical solidarity trailed along, adding to the suggestion that traditional societies tend to suppress individuality and foster collective responsibility and group solidarity, whereas modern societies tend to require individual autonomy while undercutting the communal resources that would make it possible. Yet typically, such attempts at a historical anthropology of identity, far from overcoming this dilemma, only underscored the fact that the tension between the individual and the collective forms of identity has been constitutive of the identity's concept's rise. Both Erikson and Korsgaard use of the term suggests that one creates a unique individual identity largely by participating in and identifying with some larger community of shared meaning. Echoing the Tocquevillian logic of illiberal or free association, identity language tends to imply a kind of pride of ownership. As one acquires an identity, one acquires a world of meaning along with a sort of positive liberties that come with participation in a group. The triumph of this linguistic paradigm in the age of neoliberalism is itself remarkable. I mean, is it remarkable? It's not like a coincidence. In Erikson's psychological or Korsgaard's moral ethical version of identity, the notion that the individual needs to have an identity and that society should do what it can to foster the emergence and expression of such an identity indeed represents a kind of multicultural supplement to a Whiggish liberal conception of history and rational choice theory. The assumption that everything is getting gradually better, that individuals are becoming gradually more free, is reinforced by the idea that identity and culture represent new areas of expanding emancipation and a hierarchy of liberations. Just as the emergence of cultures, in the plural, signifies the liberation of groups otherwise suppressed by the power of the majority, so individuals gradually overcome oppression through the articulation of identities. That's a beautifully put paragraph. That's a key paragraph in this. That was really good. Part of the reason for the rising correlation between freedom and identity comes from the way the concept of identity has expanded the liberal language of rights by defining otherwise unpolitical cultural activity as political. Personal identity gains a public dimension as the effects of self-making are seen as extending outward from the individual into the larger culture. The language of identity allows for an ethics of self-creation and for an ethics of recognition of others, but it also allows for a politics of demonstrative refusal of recognition. If every act of identity, making it potentially a political act, then the question of affiliation and the meaning of struggle for recognition can become richly complex, overlaying the expectation of a thick recognition of difference onto a thin formal notion of legal equality. As for the post-World War II world engaged in a successful struggle to remove forms of caste, racial, and sexual discrimination from de jure legal codes, the movement of history tended toward demands for recognition of otherwise marginalized forms of subjectivity. Redefining liberty in terms of expressive subjectivity, these new identity formations have not only broadened the meaning of liberation, they have also expanded the complexities within the discourses of freedom in ways that have made freedom seem incomplete identity a more desirable solution. The lexical graph from Google's Ngram corroborates the conceptual story. Identity has risen alongside the rise of culture, and the two together appear to be gradually absorbing the language of freedom as a means of expressing the meaning of individual liberation and explaining the dynamics of group formation and social causality. The raw semantic drift towards the language of culture and identity correlates to a conscious post-World War II movement, one that intensified greatly in the late 1960s toward conceiving of a layer of freedom that unfolds according to individuals' access to cultural particularity, their consciousness of and ability to participate in collective modes of identity. Identity in the shadow of domination. The confrontation between Adorno and the students in the late 1960s prefigured the historical conceptual expansion of identity, the students' utopian anticipation of a transformation of the meaning of politics itself would be, at least in part, confirmed by the remarkable changes that occurred when identity entered into the public sphere in the form of movements for recognition of sexual, gender, ethnic, or racial identities. But though Adorno's death in the middle of this confrontation cut short the full discussion, it is clear that Adorno identified not only the tension between individual and collective that would increasingly characterize discourses on identity in the last century, but also the challenges that would arise from this essential tension. In emphasizing the importance of a non-identity between the professional and collective forms of liberation, as well as among personal authority, personal or scientific authority, and state authority, Adorno was pointing to many of the problems involving the relation between group and individual identity that have become increasingly evident to theorists of the last decade. The mereology of identity includes the fact that sometimes the very thing that is liberating for the group is a burden for the individual and vice versa. That personal and collective responsibility is often a shared burden, and that agreement on what defines a group often subtly exacerbates tensions within the group or that individual that fuel reactionary patterns or exclusion of conflict. As the concepts of personal and group identity have become routine ingredients of public life and discourse, these tensions have not disappeared but create problems whenever attempts to articulate matters of public responsibility have encountered the individual and collective divide. A recent example of the problems that arise when identity is invoked as a principle of collective responsibility can be found in a speech given on February 2nd, 2015 by Joachim Gauck, President of the Federal Republic of Germany, commemorating the 17th anniversary of the Red Army's liberation of Auschwitz. Gauck responded to the Reichstag about the question of historical memory in post-reunification Germany. His assessment begins on an Adornian theme, with the idea that the majority of Germans would like to forget about the Nazi past, and unfolds into a discussion about how powerful the will to forget is in modern society. The part of Gauck's speech is in fact a nod at the Institute for Social Research's Grumpen experiment, which studied German attitudes in 1955. A time when the perpetrators of the Holocaust were still alive. The study showed Germans seeking to deflect not just responsibility, but memory, and not just memory, but self-identification with the perpetrating groups. As the speech builds, and Gauck connects the question of collective memory to the problems of national self-consciousness, the references to the Institute's work become more clear. Germany in the 1950s, Gauck argues, indeed thought of themselves as Germans almost exclusively to the extent that they practiced the art of shifting blame for the Holocaust onto some external historical force or foreign group. Whether by imagining themselves as powerless to influence public life, by fostering the myth that Germany was attacked first, by insisting that National Socialism seized power from without, or by denying that they or their fellows ever held fantasies of domination, revenge, or racial supremacy. Extending the 1955 argument that willful amnesia is an extension of the crime, Gauck insisted that the imperative to remember applied not just to those directly guilty, but also to those who became Germans with so-called grace of late birth, or those who, because they lived or were born in East Germany, imagined themselves to be anti-fascist by definition, and thus to be free of guilt. Summarizing the duty of all Germans, even those born post-reunification, to reflect continuously on their national past, Gauck uttered the, quote, subclause that inspired dozens of headlines. There is no German identity without Auschwitz. Yeah, I don't know about that. Why would why would just any random German be responsible for Auschwitz? I don't get it. Anyways. Gauck's speech is sober, reflective, and responsible, and also not just fully in control of its governing concept. His speech represents the best of what a head of state has said about how the experience of World War II must continue to shape the collective consciousness of globally engaged citizens regarding the problems of mass murder and genocide. Nonetheless, a statement comes across as strange and jarring. The reason for this is rooted deep in the logic of identity and its historical residues. The positive valence of the concept of identity, with all its unavoidable connotations of self-discovery, self-mastery, and futurity, sits oddly with the exhortation to take responsibility for the brutal objectification of selves in the Nazi era. The positivity of identity logic tends as a principle of its own health and strength to promulgate myths of self-making, to cultivate forgetfulness, and it tends to view notions of duty or weakness as useless or even harmful. Modern identity consciousness aligns with nationalism in wanting self-making without self-incrimination. Thus, though it was clearly the opposite of Gauck's intention to characterize Auschwitz as an achievement of the Germans, his representation of Auschwitz as the foundation of German ideology carries with it echoes of barbarians crowing over the corpses of their victims. The victims of Nazi mass murder surely did not die so that a coherent Germanist could thrive. Yet the logic of the making of identity implies this, to define victims reductively as objects for the forging of their oppressor's collective subjectivity. Lacking a language for the negativity of identity, for the ways selves are shaped through injuries to others that redound on the self, Gauck's invocation of identity struggles not to reify mass murder into a life or death confrontation between dominant and subaltern groups. In the case of Nazism, this risk at the very least positing an essentiality to Germanness and Jewishness that reinforces the racially purified and historically falsified image of Germanness advanced by the Nazis themselves, and that effaces the instrumental role that aggression played in the assertion of that identity. In drawing on the language of identity to articulate the ongoing responsibility of contemporary Germans for the crimes of their grandfathers, Gauck unintentionally demonstrates how weak and unstable identity in its national mode is at commemorating victims and takes responsibility for collective crimes. It is ironic here that Gauck not only meant no harm in invoking identity, that he was seeking to be a responsible statesman, but that, in doing so, he was also invoking one of Adorno's most celebrated lines, the pronouncement that there could be no poetry after Auschwitz. Yet, the fact that an attempt to use Adorno as a resource for 21st century political discourse produced this awkward result is itself telling on multiple levels. In shifting Adorno's argument from poetry to identity, Gauck was seeking to ground an ethical negative historical consciousness in something that seems more proximal to the psyche than the expressive product of a national culture. Identity seems to modernize Adorno's stricture for a generation less invested in verse, but Gauck unfortunately failed to see the relevance of the rest of Adorno's sentence. To engage in a cultural critique of the barbarity of culture and point to poetry's impossibility erodes even the insight and intelligence that pronounces it as such. Adorno believed the lyric poet had non-identity in its identity. It is, but also is not, a mode of collective expression. Cultures express, cultures create themselves through their poetry, yet the power of lyric poetry derives from the fact that what is expressed is not the wholeness of the culture, but the woundedness and woundability of the individual self. The fact that the relation between individual and collective always involves a dimension of injury, Adorno was therefore arguing that insofar as the connection between poetry and culture could be addressed, this must be done imminently and historically. And attempting to translate Adorno into the 21st century by addressing identity rather than culture, Gauck was making precisely the reduction Adorno sought to warn against. Adorno, at the end of his life, was exploring ways of countering the student's vernacular language of identity with a negative approach to identity and philosophical non-identity. Gauck's misunderstanding of how to apply Adorno's ideas and the distortion of the point he was attempting to make indicates at once the need for just such a negative concept of identity as Adorno was exploring, and for a more precise vocabulary for this negativity and the social substance of non-identity. This need is perhaps all the more palpable for the fact that Gauck's attempt to deploy a critical construction of identity reverberates not only with the old action logic of the cult of the deed, the fascist obsession with unity and purity, but also with the more recent languages of European identity, advanced by a new generation of right-wing activists explicitly opposed to the mandate of critical historical self-examination. Already in the 1960s, Adorno worried that identity thinking favored the cultivation of social antipathies without objective responsibilities. By the 21st century, this concern had proven predictive. Despite identity's long-standing association with the progressive causes, identity has become a favorite tool of right-wing and reactionary discourses. On both sides of the Atlantic, there have been emerging religio and ethno-nationalist identity movements that declare themselves spontaneous counter-movements to left-wing identity politics. There is a Christian identity movement in the United States that cultivates an anti-Semitic and racist theology designed to hasten an end-times prophecy by forcibly returning the Jews to Israel, among other anti-governmental fantasies. In Europe, the Generation Identitaire movement seeks to purge the European Union member nations of foreign immigrants and their culture, and to reassert the ethnic roots of nationality. The leaders of these movements draw on the languages of identity and culture as wedge issues for mobilizing resentment, and have become quite savvy at amplifying identitarian rage through social media and sensationalized news. When the language of existential danger is re-injected into identity discourse, a whole set of reactionary notions of encirclement, dilution, and corruption from within are reincorporated into language of identity and culture that has been articulated as permanently replacements for the concept of race. When Geert Wilders and Renaud Camus, practitioners of this new right-wing identity discourse in Europe, speak the language of identity, they do so to stoke the fears that the white race and its culture are, quote, being replaced by immigrants with strong settler mentality, self-aware of their identity in a way that supposedly weak liberals have forgotten. One can observe that identity language is increasingly being used as a reactionary counter-discourse, espousing nationalist identity without accusing Gauck or other progressive advocates of culture and identity of being essentially reactionary. It is, however, clear that identity has become a treacherous and contested terrain. The discourse of identity as subjective liberation is shadowed by its vitiation of the language of objective historical reflection. Identity's utility in imagining new possibilities for freedom is complicated by its instrumentalization of the purposes of identifying enemies and inventing collective antagonisms. For this reason, it is useful to pay attention to Adorno's original complaint, his insistence that it is incumbent on theory to distinguish more clearly among positive and negative subjective and objective uses of identity within the non-identical fields of culture, society, psychology, and law. Just as in 1958, Isaiah Berlin found it necessary to distinguish between two types of liberty, positive and negative, in order to understand the relation of liberty to concepts of law and the state, so it seemed increasingly important to distinguish positive from negative identity in order to analyze its subjective and objective dynamics. Identity, far from being self-identical, is not one. Positive and negative identity. Subject becomes object. This book argues that identity was born to be a more dialectical, interdisciplinary, and objective concept than what it has become. It argues furthermore that one can see the lineaments of an alternative history of identity in the critique of subjectivity, alterity, and racism articulated in the exile writings of Theodor Adorno. Adorno's approach to psychology and sociology, epistemology and ontology, law and politics, an approach based on an understanding of the conflicted non-identities within all assertions of identity, holds untapped promises not just for the theory of domination and emancipation, but for our understanding of the relation between individuality and public life, science and expression. The narrow historical and linguistic claim for this argument has to do with the history of the word identity itself. Though Erik Erikson became a more celebrated promoter of the concept of identity, he had himself adopted the term identity from Erich Fromm's 1941 international bestseller, Escape from Freedom. This book was also an important starting point for Adorno, having been Fromm's junior colleague and rival at the Frankfurt Institute for Social Research. Adorno objected to what he saw as Fromm's romanticization of unalienated subjectivity in the figure of the Renaissance man. Rejecting this notion of identity, Adorno built his core critical idea around a negative articulation of Fromm's hopeful invocation of a self strong enough to resist the crushing power of capitalism and fascism. Starting from the assertion that investigation of the I needed to be accompanied by an investigation of the not I, Adorno began to explore the implications of the idea that modern philosophy and social thought had ascribed too much power to the subject and to subjectivity, and had not devoted enough effort to saying that what subjectivity is not. Though Adorno's engagement with the question began with, and crucially never lost sight of, the political problem of how capitalism nurtures fascism within itself, Adorno's analysis quickly went beyond the areas Fromm addressed. Adorno criticized all invocations of essential and pure origins, and he carried this critique over from the realm of political analysis to philosophy and the theory of science, to approaches to perspectival disciplinarity and logical non-identity. Startlingly, Adorno warned not only against the reactionary possibility of political arguments based on identity, but also against any judgment grounded in self rather than an object. There is a moment of content to the form itself, seen in the transcendental critique that sympathizes with authority before expressing any content. The expression as a I, in which one can insert any orientation from dialectical materialism to Protestantism, is here symptomatic. Anyone who judges by presuppositions that do not hold within that which is being judged behaves in a reactionary manner, even when he swears by progressive slogans. Rejecting the assumption that the subjective position from which an individual views an object grants a special authority, Adorno also discerns a similarly damaged relationship to the object in scientific discourses that claim to produce objectivity by imposing the perspectivity of the discipline of the non-object of study. Out of this observation arose an interdisciplinary dialectic of the not-I that refused to take selfhood or objectivity for granted, but saw the negation of selfhood as the beginning of both subjectivity and objectivity. Adorno, I argue, devoted his mature thought to understanding how sociological and psychological ideas of the self as actors had been grafted onto the core notions of epistemology and ontology, and his exploration of the fault lines and possibilities of this graft led Adorno to make his negative turn as a philosopher. This negative turn injected the language of non-identical into the analysis of every form of positivity, the assertion and apodietictic, the constative and performative modes of identity assertion, while expanding the phenomenology of experience so that it could account for every element of objective coercion, from the categorical reduction of agency through instrumentality to the ascription of negative blinding labels of social roles and hierarchies. The crucial term for the insights Adorno sought to achieve through his negative philosophy was non-identity. Cutting across his late work in logic, epistemology, sociology, and psychology, non-identity spoke in each case of a problem. The concept never exhausted its objects. The clean lines of language and thought were always insufficient to the totalities and particularities of reality. Allegories and analogies, typologies and symbols, the categories and the concepts of law and their sciences failed to express the relation to things, and they concealed the failure of their naming. For Adorno, non-identity was at once a fundamental epistemological problem and a sweeping social and historical one. The rift between concept and object was always a scar, a remnant of the social history of domination and instrumentalization that allowed the subject to make itself by forming its object. To read for non-identity was to trace out his history of injury and to become aware of the possibility of reversal. Subject could become object. Object could become subject, the dominant, the victim. Yet Adorno also believed that a full knowledge of might take account of this insufficiency and the concept of self-sufficiency, subjectivity, that it might recover substantive knowledge through the analysis of apparent contradiction. In nature and art, according to Kant, open a window into the sublime by mapping out the limits of our understanding, so Adorno believed that the non-identical allows us to confront the conflict of the faculties and the social substances of the subject constituted by the forms of reason. To read along the cicatrix of non-identity was to discover every epistemological value in this dialectical application of objective reason to constitute subjectivity and vice versa. Non-identity is to Adorno's philosophy what spirit was to George William Frederick Hegel's philosophy, or being was to Heidegger, a keyword position at the center of a philosophical system. Drawn together was the central ideas of a lifetime of philosophical inquiry. Adorno's non-identity has, however, received far less attention than these other concepts, either in terms of its unifying role in Adorno's thought, or in terms of its utility in relation to broader strains of 20th and 21st century thought. Though a small but growing number of scholars have, for instance, recognized the relevance of critique of non-identity to be concept of nature within the project of environmental studies, the possibility of developing interdisciplinary inquiry connecting to the problem of nature to the construction of the object in other disciplines or to problems of negativity and subjective identity has not been explored. There are several reasons for this relative neglect. One is that previous scholars had misread Adorno's interest in negativity as a form of psychological and historical pessimism. Another, in the terms that non-identity became dominant late in Adorno's career, summarizing decades of work in which Adorno explored this idea in the language of a range of disciplines, and that its function as a kind of keystone in the architecture of his thought was less clearly established than it might have been at the time of his death. The importance of this concept for developing a science of negatively expressed in real human suffering and mastery, remains to be explored. Drawing on the distinction between positive and negative liberty that first appeared not in Berlin's essay but in Fromm's Escape from Freedom, this book advances the distinction between positive and negative identity as a heuristic to elucidate how Adorno's philosophical critique of non-identity emerged from his American years, and from his work on defining the relation between authoritarian politics and racism. just as the distinction between positive and negative liberty served Fromm and Berlin by providing a clarifying paraphrase of the Hegelian problem of political liberty from a subjective point of view, so the distinction between positive and negative identity can illuminate Adorno's Hegelian approach to identity and its consequences for philosophy and sociology, for the idea of subjectivity in the history of domination. Hegel was a thinker of systems, social and logical, and of the subject as an expressive autonomous being. He was also a theorist of liberty, slavery, and legitimate-illegitimate authority. Adorno, more than any previous Marxist thinker, was interested in defining how modern subjectivity, in both its positive and negative dimensions, was simultaneously autonomous, a creator of meaning, independent, enmeshed in a spirit of social reproduction. Adorno studied how forms of subjectivity mediate the broader system of social domination and vice versa, looking at how cells have their own inner dynamics that partly mediate and define social relations, but also how the bourgeois' obsession with selfhood can occlude the ability to understand the social systems and forms of domination in which we live, carrying on what Peter Gordon has called a contestatory dialogue with the philosophers of bourgeois interiority. Adorno developed a wide variety of terms for his project, whether through his calls for a critique of identity, his critique of the jargon of authenticity, or his interest in the dialectics of the individual and the particular, the non-identity of thinking and being, and proposing a distinction between positive and negative identity. This book seeks to show, first, how a concern for the negative dimensions of identity constituted a red thread in Adorno's thought, and second, how Adorno's approach to the negativity of identity can help resolve the kinds of problems that, as we have seen with the example of Gauck, increasingly present themselves when identity is invoked to mediate questions of knowledge and ethics, individual and collective responsibility, majority and minority rights. To consider Adorno's philosophical work in terms of the concept of negative identity is to recognize a challenge to the existing scholarship on the Frankfurt School. The literature on Adorno, still burdened by the misunderstanding dating from 1968 to 69 moment, has largely taken for granted that Adorno was hostile to the new philosophical concerns and social movements of the 1960s and has failed to connect Adorno's critique of personality and identity to his exploration of logical and social negativity or to his understanding of the nature of social abstraction. The story is both more complicated and more interesting than that. As I seek to show, recognizing that Adorno's later critical theory shared a common starting point with the identity discourse that proliferated in the later 20th century, not only clarifies what remains at stake in an Adornian critique of identity, but also shows how Adorno's work points towards the relevance of a critique of subjective identity for the theorization of interdisciplinary objectivity. Far from simply opposing identity, Adorno's work can help us understand how the analysis of identity as negative identity needs to be extended into the theory of objectivity. The key to this exposition will be to pursue the origins of non-identity historically, in terms of its emergence from the methodological problems that a universalist encountered in studying the phantasm of racism as objective false consciousness. If Adorno did not live to articulate the full dimensions of what he called non-identity, the story of how experiences of negative identity compelled Adorno to address identity as a central problem of the 20th century can help make clear how Adorno's critique of fascism, anti-Semitism, and racism's inverted construction of the other, developed in America, were not only integral to, but also the foundations of his later post-exile philosophical engagements. A century of wounded universality. If one approaches identity not as a subjective notion of freedom, but as an objective fact encoded in passports and identity cards, as much as in the minds of the civil majority, positive identity shares a horrifying history with the modern state's mode of exclusion. The Nuremberg laws of 1935, modeled on the Jim Crow laws of segregation post-Civil War, America outstripped their model by setting the stage for the mass deportation and mass murder. But both these racial laws imposed a binding negative identity upon their citizens. The aftermath of World War I and the attempt to develop new territorial nation-states out of the old empires created millions of stateless and semi-stateless people whose only purchase on a universal identity took the form of the negation of their past. Depending on which side of the bayonet, machine gun, or barbed wire one stood, identity could appear in the 20th century either as a kind of privilege or as an unobtainable goal, such as a conclusion that one must draw if one views subjective non-identity in a coldly objective way. Though one can speculate as to whether the expanded subjectivity itself fueled an expansion of alterity, the historical record reflects that in the 20th century, forms of identity proliferated not just as part of liberation, but as an outgrowth of a century of violence and upheaval. From the growth of coercive group membership to the proliferation of forms of globalized collective subjectivity, involuntary and voluntary, identity expanded objectively and must be enumerated as one of the tools of authoritarian mass movements. It is an inescapable fact that millions of people were murdered in the 20th century for having identities that were in fact imposed from without, and as many, perhaps more identities, were forged, ascribed, and coerced as were freely given, received, or embraced. Objectively speaking, the 20th century made identities, made them optional and obligatory at once. Though the 20th century did not invent the situation in which having the right identity could win one political or economic rights, it made negative identity as ubiquitous as identity itself. When one thinks along with Adorno's experience of the 20th century, it is clear that he initially perceives these objective problems of negative identity as belonging to his historical past. Like many observers of European social democracy after the war, Adorno came of age with the expectation that as empires were dissolved by nation-states, and nation-states were absorbed by global capital, the role of economic global forces in determining the shape of life would expand, while the need to define one's national or group identity would fade. One needed to define oneself as an individual, but not as a member of a group per se. It took hard experience to unseat this bias towards global and teach Adorno's generation that small details of heritage or historical experience could matter in relation to the forces of modernization. Both in Wilhelmine, Germany in 1903, to a Jewish father and a Catholic Italian mother, Adorno had a mixed identity. He was neither not Jewish nor not Jewish. He was culturally and legally a German citizen until that citizenship was stripped from him by the Nazi government. During his middle years, from 1933 to the mid-1950s, Adorno lived in the United States, employed first as a researcher on music and mass media in the age of radio, later as a social scientist researching how anti-Semitism and racism developed in reaction to changes in both the economy and the personality structure of the individual. This process of research and immigration, which led to the publication of the 1950 and landmark Authoritarian Personality, and culminated in Adorno's return to Germany to teach philosophy and sociology in the mid-1950s, brought about a philosophical reevaluation amounting to a profound reversal in his thought. Before coming to the United States in 1937, Adorno had a substantial, complete history of social causality, culture, and individual knowledge that one might describe as an Enlightenment universalism buttressed at its crumbling edges by a kind of modernist Jacobinism. He was an avant-garde aesthete, a Marxistian system theorist, and a heterodox Kantian who stood opposed to subjectivistic and psychologistic theories of culture. Like other Marxists and most Kantians of Adorno's generation, he did not accept the idea that people's self-conceptions are pivotal for how history is made or how politics unfolds. Both of these traditions of universalism emphasized objectivity and law in a way that stood in stark contrast to the idea that individual subjectivity, identifications with nationalities or groups, are worthy of significant study because they shape daily praxis. To take the subjective identification seriously, even in a negative way, would require a significant reassessment of the philosophical and political traditions represented not just by the Frankfurt School, but also by every movement associated broadly with the left. With liberation. Instead, Adorno's Kantian Marxism sought to advance the notion of the rights of man by riding out the tide of modernist self-consciousness as it unfolds alongside advancing production methods and an advancing division of labor. Marxian materialism intermingled with a Kantian belief in science and universal subjectivity, and with a Nietzschean and avant-garde belief that each individual needed to cultivate a critical intelligence capable of inverting the stupidities of mass culture and des idées reçues. In this mixture of philosophical values, two competing visions of a universalist relation between self and world stood in creative tension. the Marxian theory of human universality, addressed the real-world difficulties of being an autonomous subject in the ideal Kantian sense, while the Nietzschean avant-gardism allowed Kantianism to be upheld as a negative utopia. Once one recognized the delusional quality of modern culture as an imposed master morality, one could preserve philosophically a model of how an ethical and rational self, undamaged by the world, might behave if only he or she were allowed to do so. Adorno's Marxism of the 1930s combined utopian and avant-gardist movements, yielding a kind of aestheticized radicalism, in which the imperative to repair the world struggled against a kind sense of impossibility of doing so. This view of damaged universalism imagined a productive community of cultural as well as material production, in which all individuals might someday receive as much cultural investment in them as they placed in the production of goods. America challenged and changed this anti-subjective universalism, and in the most interesting way. Adorno pushed subjectivism back upon itself, becoming an innovative theorist of identity rooted in alterity and otherness, prejudice and racism. To understand how this happened, as it is to be understand how Adorno accepted, with modifications, not just one idea, but a host of interconnected concepts to whose implications he was deeply opposed. If Adorno arrived in America believing that his goal was to develop an objective Marxian social science, his understanding both of objectivity and his role as a researcher ran headlong into America's culture and academic research system. Inside and outside the university, Adorno encountered variations of the themes of cultural relativism and social adaptation. Grateful as he was as an émigré to the nation that figured on the world stage as a last bastion of freedom, Adorno could not understand how America, with their narrowly instrumental approach to objectivity and their pragmatist tendency to equate truth with success, could mount any successful defense against the fascist ideologies from which Adorno had fled. The conflict between Adorno's idealist and social universality and the American celebration of relativism and cultural particularity would shape not only his experience of exile, but also the approach to philosophy and the social sciences with which he would return to Germany. His first and dominant reaction to American social science was to seek to defend universality, both in its subjective and objective dimensions, against all attempts at relativist definition. This seemed to Adorno the only theoretically rigorous way to fend off attempts to legitimize race and national particularity as objects of scientific inquiry. It was in Adorno's second reaction to the experience of exile began to reshape theory. Instead of viewing historical and scientific knowledge as a matter of aligning the subjectivity of the inquirer with the universality within the objective of inquiry, Adorno began to ask what happened when the objectivity of subjectivity had been distorted by relations of domination. Just as in exile turns subjects into the objects and distortions the category of subjectivity, so too domination could distort science and perception in ways that only a self-reflexive and reciprocally self-conscious science, a dialectical science, could address. Once Adorno came to see things this way, his heterodox Marxianism and Kantianism entered a new phase, in which he theorized how modern society necessarily produced victims and tyrants, how it created narratives of domination and control in order to deflect insight into the exploitation and inequality. The key discovery in his history of negative identity came about as at a moment of confluence of different research agendas and historical circumstances. This was in the 1944-45 moment in which Adorno and Max Horkheimer realized that 20th century anti-Semitism was far more than hatred of Jews, or even just a peculiar European hybrid, a garden variety racism. Anti-Semitism, particularly the generative anti or negative part of it, was in fact a new populist metaphysics that sought nothing less than the reorganization of selfhood and religion, nations and states. Independent of the presence of actual Jews, modern mass-mediated anti-Semitism was an attack on political rationality and its narratives of emancipation and redemption. The key logic to anti-Semitism involved displacing the idea of the universal onto a polarized field of negative and positive subjectivity, on which complex maneuvers of victim identification and victim blaming could be carried out. The importance of Jews within this logic was largely symbolic. Jews could be used as a stand-in for the decreasing social control individuals felt over their lives. Historical reasons, of course, made the propagandistic imagery of the Jews particularly well suited for creating, in a moment of world economic crisis, an inverted image of the world spirit out of a negative identity of Jews. The Jewish historical double nature, as we speak weak and strong pariah and parvenu, was congruent with the need to personify the historical forces that were mandating an ever more advanced division of labor, an ever more forceful separation of mental and manual labor within the individual, and an ever more distasteful relation between individuals and the forces governing them. That's a really great line. Let me put that in my notes here. Dialectic of Enlightenment's stunning 1945 pronouncement that true anti-Semites no longer exist emerged out of this analysis of an objective power of negative identity in the bourgeois past and neoliberal future. Anti-Semitism was the prototypical European form of a more general, anti-subjectivist pseudo-subjectivism, a scaffold of projection that could be recast into any kind of racism, sexism, or negative identity as needed by circumstance. More importantly, the pure negative construction of identity, based on victim blaming, projection, and ascription of secret control, could find fertile ground anywhere in the modern world because the prevalent demand of capitalist consumption and production had embedded within itself a kind of impossible individualism, one that places no limits on demands of self-redefinition. Every consumer good, every quantum of labor, is stamped with the ideology that self-made it, formed it, and can enjoy it in its entirety. This subjectivism masks the objective domination of labor in nature. This redefinition of selfhood was not without its emancipatory dimension, but the point for Adorno and Horkheimer was that the inverted Kantianism of modernity had become an invisible factor of production. To survive and thrive, individuals were expected to distinguish themselves as autonomous, as laws unto themselves, in a world governed by forces beyond their control. As everyone knew that if they failed to achieve autonomy, they would be devoured by the antagonistic whole, with the only themselves to blame. This internalized set of expectations drives the inward desire for identity, the ontological need, as well as its outward expansion, the impulse to assign a name to some subjectivity, some entity or group of people who, lurking in the margins of the infernal system, are secretly directing it, controlling it, taking advantage of it, etc. Adorno came to regard this systematically distorted phenomenology of social perception as highly dynamic, capable of shifting to accommodate the needs of the subjects and designate new victims according to the historical situation. As he did so, his theoretical concern expanded from the problem of anti-Semitism to racism more generally, and to the problem of the divided self and the dialectics of identity. Adorno believed one had to be interested in the particulars of social projection of positive and negative identity. Why the Germans? Why the Jews? But also, why gender and sexual orientation? Why students and why immigrants? And yet, theory also had to rise above mere advocacy. One needed to work through the interaction between the liberation and the degenerative forms of identity, and to articulate how negative identity offered a new, false metaphysics while still being able to address questions of a universal character. This meant thinking against identity as well as with it, being aware that an obsession with the particularities of identity, even by those sworn to diffuse its horror and seek liberation in it, could undercut one's insight into the objective and the universal. This is not merely an inquiry into Adorno, but into the subjective and objective meaning of identity and its politics. As an attempt to recuperate an analytics of identity's negative side and restore a missing chapter in the history of social thought, this work is not an attack on the idea of identity, but a kind of double history. It presents, at once, a reinterpretation of the intellectual history of the Frankfurt School in the context of the American and European social thoughts, and an inquiry into the philosophical historical tension between concept of universal liberation and particularist meaning or being. Implicitly, the two histories meet in that both involve a rethinking of the residue of Hegelianism that remained part of narrative historical explanation and theories of social causation based on metaphors of the subjective. Recognizing that identity has become that contemporary guise of the concept of world spirit should make us wonder about the gain or loss in analytical power that comes from dropping the Hegelian distinction between an sich and für sich, in itself for itself, dimensions of ontology, between objective and subjective analytical perspectives, immediate and reflected self-consciousness, and the abstract and concrete historical conceptuality. The Hegelian question of how historical subjectivity can be used in a universal mode and how one can consider universality in a subjective mode remains crucial for law and ethics in a neoliberal age. Adorno's belief that human universalism must be defended while recognizing that every form of universalism can be turned against those who invoke it is a post-Hegelian insight of concept to every human science that seeks to understand modern individuals and states. This core idea of reflexive subjective and object universality, the dialectic of enlightenment in our thinking about the universal and the particular, was central to Adorno's investigation of racism. It also informed his attempt to understand how the historical transformation of ideas of subjectivity, governance, and domination made such reversals not merely possible, but likely under modern conditions. Understanding the negative elements of identity is only the beginning of the understanding its dialectic. A dialectical theory of positive and negative identity seeks to describe the objectivity of subjectivity and the subjectivity of objectivity, making possible an analysis of identity as both a false and a true consciousness of individual emancipation and oppression. Adorno's concept of woundedness, objectification, and alterity ultimately points towards the possibility that false consciousness can become the material self-reflection, that consciousness of negative identity can become a principled self-consciousness. Not identity, the dominant concern of Adorno's post-war work, should frame our understanding not only of his philosophy, but of what identity and social theory mean today. The critique of non-identity and the metaphysics of the subject develops out of a critical critique of authoritarianism and prejudice, and the fullest contours of Adorno's unfinished philosophical system are best understood not in terms of systematic closure or self-identity, but in terms of the wounds that shaped it, the experience of damaged life that compelled him to grapple with the subjective as a negative identity.